But I want to talk about my journey, or the journey generally around this issue of honour-based violence, forced marriage, and more generally around public protection over the last 15, 20 years, in order to try and give you a sense of where we've come from, how bad things were, and how we can improve things moving forward. So I was chief prosecutor in the northwest of England. Prior to that, I was chief prosecutor in London. And back in the day, so 15 odd years ago, 16 odd years ago, I realised then that one of the things we were doing very poorly as an organisation, I can't speak for the Fiscal's Office, but certainly for the Crown Prosecution Service, is we weren't engaging with the public. We knew we were meant to be independent, so we are independent, but independence was confused with detachment. And so people were not prepared to sit in a room with members of the public or NGOs or whomever, because the view was that somehow you would colour our decision making, which is a nonsense now, isn't it? It was nonsense then, but it was a nonsense now. And certainly, so it was important then to start engaging. And that was a really tough call, because I remember when we had the first knife crime epidemic in London 16 years ago, I said to my teams, we need to go and talk to young people. And they said, yes, let's invite them to our offices. Guess what? None of them came to our offices. And obviously what they had to do and realise that you need to go and talk to people where they are. And I remember one occasion actually I was talking to young men, very young men, above a bookmaker's in North London, all of them wearing bandanas across their faces as if I could identify who they were. But I never forgot that conversation. I never forgot what they had to say to me about the things that they were dealing with, which ultimately were leading to the increased criminality on the streets. And that really made me think, hang on a minute, we should be doing much more of this. We should be engaging much more with our communities, and we should lead our policies should be led not only by victims and survivors, but by generally from the community. And so I organised national conferences on all sorts of subjects. By national, I mean England and Wales, by the way, so forgive me for that. Organised these conferences on subjects that nobody else was talking about, but that interested me. And so I organised a conference on sports crime, where I talked about how the behaviour of players on the pitch impacts on spectators, impacts on the wider society, which I'm sure you all agree with me. But I was doing all these interviews on Sky News and everything else, and I got so much hate mail. I remember one in particular, "Dear Mr. Afzal, we English invented football, please go back to Wogland." I remember checking the Globe and I couldn't see Wogland anywhere. But I saw his name and address on the letter. And his name and address ended up in Harrow Police's hands, and they did some action. So I was organising these conferences in subjects that really, we were beginning to understand what we need to do differently. And so then when I was in London, a group of women from an NGOs in West London came to me and said, "Nazir, what about forced marriage?" And I said, "Are you offering?" I said, "No." I said, what do you mean? Could we have a conference about this? Can we use your offices and your resources to get everybody in the room talking about this subject? And I said, absolutely, this is really exactly what I hear, but let's find the right people. And they introduced me to people like Jaswinder Sangera from Kamanavana, and others were ready to speak, and we organised this massive conference. And I wasn't prepared for what happened that day. It was December 2004. And the world was there. The world's media was there. I did 31 national and international television interviews in one day. I've never done any more than that in one day. And that was because, invariably, Australian TV, American TV, Italian, they all, what's this very exotic thing that's happening in the UK, this forced marriage thing, And they didn't understand it, we didn't understand it, but more importantly, what we were doing in that conference was listening to victims and survivors. And I had managed to get all these ministers and senior officials and senior civil servants in the room to listen to survivors. And that was fantastic, because for the first time they were hearing about a subject they really hadn't understood or even been aware of, to be blunt. And so we organised this conference, and then, as I mentioned the earlier conferences, usually what happens is I walk away. That's it. Let somebody else do all the hard work. I couldn't do it in this case, because the NGOs I mentioned said, "Nazir, two things. One is, there's no man talking about this subject, and we'd like you, please, to talk about this subject. And number two, you've got influence, so maybe you can open up the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, and maybe they can start talking about this subject." I said, fine, okay, but you need to tell me about this. The reason I say that is because people make assumptions that because I'm brown, it must be something that I've lived with all of my life. You know, I have been married 3 times, ladies and gentlemen. My first wife was Irish Catholic. My second was Hindu. My third and long-lasting was formerly Sikh. So I've done my bit for multi-faith engagement, right? But at no time was I forced into marriage. But people make assumptions, you know, that you're brown, it must be around you all the time. And of course, we also are male, which is, you know, there are male victims, and you'll hear about them, I'm sure, during the course of the day. But, you know, invariably, 85% or thereabouts of the victims that we're aware of in the UK, anyway, are female. So, and worldwide, it's probably even more. So we've got to recognize that that's the issue we're dealing with. And it was not something that I was familiar with, but people made assumptions and prejudices. There was, yeah, assumptions, prejudices, Nazir, you must know about this, blah, blah, blah. Nonsense. I knew nothing about this. And I was listening to people like Jaswinder and others, hearing their stories, hearing what they were telling me, that made me realize, oh my God, this is an issue that we've just barely touched. And you know, even then, I hadn't realized I'd actually prosecuted a case of honor-based murder. And that was a case which I'll touch on. 2001 it was, a young girl called Heshi Jonas from West London. She was 16, and she was murdered by her father because she had a boyfriend. That's it. And we prosecuted then as simply a murder of a child by a father. But you know, when you dig into that, that's the reason why he killed her was because he had lost control of her. And the reason why he knew that she had a boyfriend was because a teacher had rung him up and said, she wasn't at school yesterday, is it anything to do with her boyfriend? I don't blame the teacher. I blame lack of awareness, lack of training, lack of understanding. And nobody blames the teacher. But the important thing is, you know, had we been aware, had somebody been aware, they would not have said that to that particular person. And then, of course, the other thing that happened in that particular case was the judge sentenced the father to life. You have to give life for murder, but the minimum tariff, 8 years. Because it must be really difficult being a father when your daughter's out of control, said the judge. Wow. That's 2001, 17 years ago. Well, we've come a long way from then. Now we see it for what it is. That's aggravated circumstances. That's an abuse of trust. The father should get, and does get, a longer sentence for the homicide, rather than, in that case, mitigated because of the loss of control, crying out loud. But you know, all that is about raising awareness. All that is about understanding what you're dealing with. So, you know, I'd prosecuted that case, I'd recognized that case, but I hadn't recognized that there was an issue for us, all of us, in tackling this issue. So once I'd become aware of this, I began to understand more about forced marriage. And forced marriage, as you will have heard already, I imagine, takes so many different forms. So you have the ones where there is violence and threats of violence. You have the ones where duress apply. You have the ones where, you know, parents know what buttons to put in a child, so they press all the emotional buttons, which encourages them, well, encourages is not the right word, but forces them into marriage. Or you have deception, where you're shown a picture of somebody who looks like David Beckham as your groom, and you end up marrying somebody who looks like me, you know? There are all, don't laugh, there are so many different dynamics when it comes to forced marriage. So often I've heard, for example, I think forced marriage is one of the best cures for heart disease. Why do I say that? Girl leaves home, next thing she hears, Mum's had a heart attack, you must come back. She comes back, fine now, you know? All of those things, all that sort of dynamic is just a level of awareness that you only pick up by talking to victims and survivors. So once you understood what we were dealing with in terms of forced marriage, the next thing was to understand honor-based violence. Because honor-based violence, forced marriage is a symptom of honor-based violence. You know, all of this is driven by, well, the issue of honor, it's often said it's driven by honor, it's actually driven by power and control, which I think we all understand. That's the easiest way to understand it. When I had that conference I mentioned, I got all these phone calls from, after the international coverage, all these phone calls from other countries. The Italians rang me up and said, Nazir, oh, honor, I can't do an Italian accent. You know, we've been dealing in honor and fighting for honor for thousands of years since the Roman times. I said, okay. And then the French, nope, can't do a French accent either. They said dueling, we had dueling at dawn. That was to restore the honor. I said, no, you didn't. You had a gun each. This is not the same thing, you know? But, you know, so all the world seemed to think that they understood what they were dealing with, but they weren't. They didn't understand it. It comes down, as I said earlier on, to power and control. To understand that somebody does not want to lose control, which is why they force you into marriage, which is why they harm you when you choose to make choices. You know, and I think that's one of the things that we have to remember. This is about choices. You and I have choices that we can make on a daily basis. There are people denied that, thousands, tens of thousands of people who are denied the ability to make the choices that you and I take for granted. A choice around education, a choice around who your partner will be, whether you want to be in a relationship, whether you want to get out of a relationship, whether you want to be whether you want to follow your sexuality, whatever it is that you choose to do, those are choices that we are guaranteed by human rights legislation going back decades and decades and decades, but there are families who do not care a diddly whatever about human rights legislation. Because for them, what's most important is the solidity of the family, the maintaining of order. And that, I think, is where we have to always remember that. And so the next thing to do was, once I'd begun to talk to survivors and begun to understand the issue, I needed to get people around the table. So I organised a working group of all the senior leaders from Home Office, Education Department. This is England and Wales. Well, at that time, it was the UK, wasn't it? So it would have been Home Office, Ministry of Justice, Education, Health, all around the table, senior civil servants. Right, what's your issue? What are you doing about this? Oh, didn't know anything about it. And guess what? So it took us a year to define honor-based violence. The definition you now have, which is national, internationally agreed, took us a year to develop. And it was a year of, you know, I'm the first person to pay tribute to the NGOs in this room, but God, that was a tough year. They could not agree on anything, and they probably still can't. But the point is, we got to a point where we had a definition. And then what else do we need to do? Well, what about guidelines? We need to improve the service that we offer. And so it's about producing guidance, and guidance for police, guidance for health, guidance for education, you name it, guidance. But in order to get that guidance, you had to know the stories. So let me tell you some stories. So when you make assumptions. You make assumptions about what we're dealing with. One of the assumptions you'll make is that this is poor people who are uneducated. Only poor people are uneducated do this. Let me tell you about Samara Nazir, my surname, from West London. She had been to university. Her family were extraordinarily wealthy. They had owned large swathes of West London, cash and carries here, there, and everywhere. Samara fell in love with a refugee. That's it. That's all she did. Fell in love with a refugee. First time she'd fallen in love with anybody. Her mother obviously discovered this and said, "You can't have it. This can't happen. You can't." And you know, why was that? I mean, I've tried to, you know, one of the things we don't understand is what's really going on in there. But part of that was around materialism. You know, we have a real status here. We don't want a refugee in our family. We might lose our material benefits, but it's our status that's at risk. So Mum takes Samara along to her boyfriend on that April morning, 10 a.m., and says to her boyfriend, to Samara, "Please stop loving each other." You know, I did a program not long ago with Joseph Fiennes, Shakespeare in Love, where we're talking about Romeo and Juliet, because that's about honor. There's a line in Romeo and Juliet where she says, "The thing I fear most about you is your name." Yeah? So this was this. Their name, that was so important in that family, Romeo and Juliet. It was so important for Samara's family. Their name was that important. He was not going to say, "I'm not going to love her." Of course, I love her. 2 hours later, Samara is stabbed 18 times in the presence of 2 infant nieces who are splattered with her blood. 2 hours later. That is the escalation. It's like nothing else I know. Usually there's a negotiation period, a transition period. I've heard that somewhere recently. There is usually a period, but no, 2 hours, which is why another rule is the first contact rule. That if you are whoever you are, you come across somebody who is seeking your assistance, you do not say to them, "I don't know anything about this, come back tomorrow." There was no tomorrow for Samara. as there isn't for many, many victims. So we have to recognize that. It was easy for me to prosecute the 16-year-old cousin who actually stabbed Samara. Why the 16-year-old cousin? Because least likely to get the sentence. Smallest sentence he'd get, and additionally less to lose, and easily malleable. But he didn't do it alone. So in order to get other members of the family, those of you who are police officers in this room, we had to authorize covert policing, including listening devices, because there was a real omerta, a real, wall of silence. You got him, he did it. No, he didn't. You put him up to it, but that's not enough for a court case. Having an argument, you have to have evidence. And so we put listening devices in. The first time was in a goldfish bowl, and all we got was boom, 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 for about 3 or 4 days. But we got evidence. We got evidence against the brother, and we got evidence against the father, and both of them were prosecuted. And ultimately, the father died while the jury were out. Brother was convicted of her murder. Now, something was said about brother, because one thing I do know about that family is that when we did some background on the brother loved his sister like nobody loves anybody. The two of them, brother, that's it, two of them, he adored his sister more than you can imagine. And yet, despite that, he was prepared to go along with the murder of his sister. That's what you're up against when you're dealing with issues of honor and this type of behavior. You've got to recognize the pull is greater than perhaps anything else that you've experienced in your lives, in terms of the magnetism and the impact it has on the family. Samara, we brought them to justice, and that was good. And they got really aggravated sentences for what they did. And I hope that will send out a message, but it wasn't enough. And then people say, it's irrational what they're doing to each other. It is irrational. 9-year-old Alicia Begum from Birmingham was the youngest victim of an honor killing that I'm aware of in this country. Alicia was murdered because, sadly, her home was set on fire and she hid in a cupboard. 9 members of her family escaped. Do you know why? Her older brother was texting a girl from another family. That's it. Texting. She died, she'll never know why, because of that and that alone. And they employed hitmen to do the job. This is where your organized crime thing comes in. It's not that's why we've not mainstreamed it as part of domestic abuse, because we recognize there's a familial element to it, but it's organized crime. Hitmen being, and I'm trying to think now, not one of the hitmen that I've prosecuted has ever been paid for the job. It's really important to us to do this. It's about the solidarity of our community and our family and our nation, whatever it is. I'll do it for you. Wow. So where's the money trail? Which generally you want to look for a hitman. Not there, is it? But that's what we're up against. So Alicia was murdered by hitmen. And then you think, right, so it's not because of their poor education. It's not because of it is because it's irrational and illogical. And when I said earlier on about prejudice and assumptions, you make assumptions about me, I make assumptions about you. Leave them at the door. When you're dealing with something in this area, you need to leave your assumptions at the door, because people are acting irrationally. And so when I prosecuted the case of Banaz Mahmood, which I'll touch on now, you have to remember what we're dealing with. Banaz was 16 when she was forced into marriage. She comes from a North London Kurdish family, and she had been beaten black and blue by her husband. At the age of 18, her parents reluctantly allowed her home, because she'd have been dead otherwise. But that was the beginning of the end, because there's no way on earth that they were going to let her do anything. So at the age of 19, Banaz falls in love for the first time in her life. And her greatest crime was that she kissed her boyfriend outside of a tube station in South London. That's it. That's all she did. It was seen by somebody from the community. That person went round to her father and uncle's house and said, "How dare your daughter, niece, kiss somebody in public? How dare she?" Now, I have no doubt if somebody came and told me that about my daughter, that I'd be in the cells tomorrow in relation to him. But that's not what happened in Banaz's case, because Banaz led to those men, the uncle and the father, sitting down with 6 other men that evening and deciding that Banaz must die. No more warnings, no messing about, she must die. Now, another one for your books, Banaz, A Love Story, the Emmy Award-winning documentary, is available on YouTube for free. Watch it. I'm in it. That's a different story. But watch it anyway, because it tells you more about this case. And then we had to prosecute. Why? Because Banaz was abducted off the streets of London. She was raped by one of the men that abducted her, and she was strangled with shoelaces and then stuck in a suitcase that was buried 100 miles up north in Birmingham under a fridge in a back garden. Now, Caroline Good, who's a phenomenal former Met officer, and her team did a brilliant job in identifying, firstly finding her. Secondly, let me rewind. Nobody reported her missing. Why would she be reported missing? They killed her. So it was only because of the brave boyfriend who went in and said, "Look, she's gone, I don't know what's happened to her," that the police were involved at all. Now, as a postscript, 10 years after this, her brave boyfriend took his own life. Another victim of that same killing. Anyway, so the police did the investigation, they found the dead body. From our perspective, relatively easy to prosecute. Father and uncle. We used covert again in order to get evidence against other members. And we identified 8 men, 8 grown men in relation to that. 2 of them fled to Iraq. Now this is 2006. Saddam has just fallen. Iraq is not a place you'd want to flee to. But they went to Iraq and they were celebrating what they had done. We knew this, the intelligence told us this. So guess what? For the first time in the 80-year history of Iraq, we got 2 men extradited back from Iraq. We got them back, we tried them, we convicted them. In fact, only recently we convicted another gentleman for his part in that. So we now have 7 men, 6 of whom are in prison for life for the murder of an 18-year-old girl for kissing her boyfriend outside of a tube station in South London. Irrational. Yeah? But why are we dealing with it? Because we could have saved Banaz. As we can save everybody that we've touched on and we've dealt with. Because, again, it's in the documentary, on one occasion, Banaz was plied with alcohol. She didn't drink. She managed to smash a window, run out of the house, run down the street, and seek help from a woman police officer. A woman police officer, seeing a distressed, bloodied young woman, smelling of alcohol, threatened to arrest her for drunken, disorderly behavior. Then, it's in the documentary as well, she goes to police and she gives a full statement of how she feels, how threatened she feels. She presents the names of 5 men that she says will kill her. The female officer says, when asked, what now? She says, "We'll get back to you." Too late. Lack of understanding, lack of awareness, lack of urgency. But Banaz could have been saved. And so Banaz led to then the ACPO and ACPOS guidelines for tackling this issue. We now have national policing guidelines, and it's Banaz's legacy. Something you won't know about Banaz's case is that it was never in my job description that I would have to bury somebody. But together with the NGO Iquiro, I had to bury Banaz because her family wanted nothing to do with her body. Now tell me that I'm not affected by that, right? But the point is that it had to be done because they weren't interested. But Banaz changed the landscape. It made us realize that we can't simply tinker around the edges, that we need to have national guidelines, that we need to have national working plans, that we all need to engage, that we have to have first contact, first contact being the right contact, that we need to escalate systems in place so that everybody knows what they're doing. If they can't help immediately, they can pass on to somebody else that can help immediately. All of that was put in place because we knew we had failed. And it's her legacy. Another young woman whose legacy we all now know is Shafila Ahmed. Remember Shafila's case from Lancashire, Cheshire? She was murdered by her family because she wanted an education. She wanted to go to school and college. They weren't interested in that. They suffocated her and they buried her in the Lake District. And for 10 years, we couldn't bring them to justice because they went on the offensive, claiming racism, discrimination, employing their own lawyers to attack the police and the prosecution service, everything under the sun. And it was only, not good fortune, it was only time that eventually led to her younger sister being able to give us evidence that would implicate her parents. And ultimately they were convicted of her murder. 10 years it took. Tülay Goran is a young girl from North London, of Turkish heritage. I've never found her body, we've never found her body, but we've still convicted her father. It took 10 years again because mother couldn't live. Mother couldn't live with what had happened, even though she had tried to live for 10 years. Ultimately, eventually, she was prepared to talk about what had happened to her daughter. We still never found it. Somewhere in Epping Forest in Essex, there is her grave, and we'll never know where it is. And she was 15, and she wanted an education. Things that you and I take for granted again. So we have to recognize this is what we're up against. And we're up against organized criminals. We're up against a culture of people who simply would want to stifle women and their ability to control their lives and any choices that women and girls would want to make. I mentioned there were male victims. I prosecuted the murderers of Arash Gurbani Zarin was murdered in Reading, and so just outside London. He was stabbed 37 or 38 times, sitting in his car, being set up, stabbed by the parent, father and brother of the girl that he was in a relationship with. Because, it's intolerable. We will choose her partner. She can't have her own choice. So when they couldn't actually didn't want to kill their own daughter, they killed her boyfriend. So we did some research actually, because people were saying to me, there are loads of male victims. There are male victims for all the reasons that you know. But when we did some research, the vast majority of male victims were murdered because of the relationship with the girl from the other family. And it's because they didn't want to kill their own daughter. Yeah, so that was what we're dealing with, to be frank. If they could have, they would have killed their own daughter. So we had to change everything. We literally had to change. I mentioned earlier on, we needed laws to change. Now, this is where you have an advantage over me, because Scottish law is different to what I've had to deal with in England and Wales. But in England and Wales, we had a conversation around protection orders. Do you have forced marriage protection orders? Right. So back in 2007, we didn't have forced marriage protection orders. And so there was a private member's bill that was going through Parliament, the UK Parliament, and the government of the time did not want to support it. And the reason why was it was going to cost £2 million a year to implement it. So I had a conversation with the then Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, the then Prime Minister. Do you remember this guy, Blair? I don't know if you remember him. And sometimes the moral case, the emotional case, the legal case isn't enough. Sometimes the business case is what's important. And so, as you will probably know, those of you police in the room, it costs £1 million to investigate and prosecute one homicide. So if we could reduce the number of homicides by 2, we'll pay for this legislation. That was the argument that Tony Blair went for, which led to him adopting it as government policy and eventually becoming government law. Shame, but sometimes that's what you have to do. But we didn't even have any data. I remember back in 2004-05 when we first started talking about the subject, we didn't know how many killings there were. We didn't have any flags that told us how much honor-based abuse or forced marriage there was. So I had to ask officers up and down the country to do hand searches. Go through your homicides and see if you can identify. And they did back in 2005. The Met came back with a figure of 12. That year, 2005, 12 victims of honor-based killings that they could identify based on what they knew. What they didn't know was about exporting, because murder is exported. If they may not be murdered here in Scotland, let's take them back to wherever our family comes from and we'll murder them there. So Sergeant Atwell, the Sikh customs officer that was murdered in India. She wanted a divorce, taken back to India for a wedding. That's dangerous. It means death. And when she's taken back to India, she's murdered. We never found her body, but ultimately, eventually, I was able to prosecute her mother-in-law and her husband for her murder. Now, the thing to be said about that one, amongst many things, is that I used to go around prisons quite regularly, and I remember going to Holloway prison, as it was then, where the 78-year-old mother-in-law was now serving 25 years minimum for the murder of Sergeant Atwell. And I was trying to do a talk to some of the prisoners about, whatever I was talking, I can't remember what it was, but it doesn't matter. But that mother-in-law used the most horrific Punjabi at me. You can't believe what she said about me, where she simply had a go at me for putting her where she was. And you know, she was proud of what she'd done. You and I might think she's going to spend the rest of her life in prison. She was proud of the fact that she had, in her view, saved the family's name. Family's name's dirt, as far as I'm concerned. And as most of us, reasonable people are concerned. But in that particular scenario, that's what you're up against again. Don't expect them to put their hands up. It always struck me how many of the people that I prosecuted never pleaded guilty. If it really was about honor and, I don't know, salvaging the honor of your family, wouldn't you want to say, I'm guilty and this is why? No, they go, not guilty, you prove it. Time and time and time again. But that's our job. That was our job. And then the US State Department came in 2008. Said, Nazir, we've got this issue too. Can you help us? And we had the forced marriage unit. We had guidelines. We now had legislation, etc. And they said, can we take that? Can we nick all that? Nick, is that a word up here? Yeah. I said, fantastic. The Americans think that we're better than them than something extraordinary. Strangely, the Americans then every couple of years would come back to me and say, what's the latest? Can we share some stuff? November 2016, they stopped asking me. What happened in November 2016? Yeah, we all know. But you have to recognize, so the Americans looked at us, and the world began looking at the work we were doing around forced marriage, honor-based violence, and said, you are making a difference to people's lives. And last year, the last figures I've seen, 5 homicides that were honor-based related in the UK. So we've saved 7 lives a year. 7 lives, we've saved 7 million quid, Tony Blair. However you want to look at it. If you want to think of it that way, we are saving lives in what you are saving lives in what you do. And that's how important it is. But you can't do it alone. You literally can't do it alone. You've got to work across agencies, across partnerships with the NGOs in this room, because they have skill sets that you don't have. So I'm patron now of 11 NGOs across the United Kingdom. And, the one I mentioned quite regularly is the one in Middlesbrough, the Halo project in Middlesbrough. The reason why I do that is that they've got some trauma-informed services. They recognise that if you escape a home, you need lifelong support. It's not just about giving you a refuge and a room over your head and a bit of counselling. You need lifelong support because these families are coming for you. They're going to come for you. They don't wait. In fact, some of them employ bounty hunters to try and identify where their family member has gone. And they often have access to databases they shouldn't have access to. And we make mistakes like, we need to go to a refuge, we'll put you in this cab. The cab driver lets the family know before she knows where she's going. Or we think, we need an interpreter. Guess what? If it's not properly accredited, the interpreter will tell the family before she knows where she's going, what needs to be done. All of these things we had to learn. And we're still learning. Because but who will tell you that? It's the NGOs like Shakti. They will tell you what you need to do. And that's why, when Debbie was telling me earlier on about training, that training is so important in this field. Because, very often if a victim manages to escape a home where she's at risk, she will go to the first building that she thinks is authoritative. It could be the town hall, it could be a hospital, it could be a school. And if that individual that sees that person can't give them signpost them for help, or give them help, then, go back to what I said earlier on, the risk to them has escalated beyond all measure, and you have to do something about it. So we prosecuted. We're getting better. The US State Department did some desk research not long ago, before 2016, and said that I've prosecuted more honor killings than anybody in the world. Am I proud of that? Yes, I'm proud of that. You know, 110 or thereabouts that I've been supervising or prosecuted. And you know, every single one of them is a story I could share with you. And we've had to use the law in really clever ways. You know, we pushed it because the law is slow at catching up. So when this young, I can't remember her surname now, but she was in web every day. I got 17,000 emails in a week to all my teams calling for me to be sacked and deported. I was born in Birmingham. I don't want to go back there, ladies and gentlemen. But remember this, I got every decision right in that case. And that's what happened to me. And it was only through the support of my teams, the support of my family, the support of the people around me that I got through what was a determined attempt to destroy me. Which is why I take nothing from the far right these days. You know, I'm more than happy to have my discussions with them, publicly or otherwise. But you have to recognize that when you get something wrong, then not only is there a cost in terms of the victim and the justice, there could be a cost to you. I spent another year protecting the two prosecutors who had failed to make the right decision in that case. Because they'd made a decision based on the way things were being done at the time. I didn't blame them. They got it wrong. But it wasn't right that people found out who they were, because if they did, I assure you, they wouldn't be around right now. They certainly wouldn't be doing their jobs right now. They'd have been hounded out. And it wasn't going to happen. So you've got to recognize that providing the level of service you do takes great teamwork. It means thinking innovatively. It means carrying the personal cost of your decisions. It means being a champion for victim survivors. It means listening to victims and survivors. But you know, when I ask myself, how can we tackle all of these subjects that I've mentioned, it comes down to education. You know, we are dealing, I left the prosecution service in 2015 because at that time, I was bored. The names may change on the front of the file, but the evidence remains the same. Somebody's hurt, blah, 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 somebody's killed. You know, I got bored by all that. And then I was prosecuting Stuart Hall twice in a year, so even the names weren't changing. You know? Stuart Hall was a good case in point. He was found guilty, the BBC presenter, found guilty of the abuse of 12 women and not guilty of one. And I went to see the one he was found not guilty of. And I said to her, I'm really sorry that I couldn't give you closure. And she said, you gave me closure the moment that you believed me. Sometimes the judicial outcome isn't the be-all and end-all. It's the fact that you in a position of authority, wherever you may be, are prepared to listen and act upon what you have heard. And that's what they want, more than anything else in the world. But, you know, in order to prevent these things from happening in the first place, you have to recognize what we're dealing with. We're dealing with violence against women and girls. We're dealing with power and control. We're dealing with misogyny. We're dealing with a society that's patriarchal and cultural. You know, I can't begin to tell you, there is no solution for which men aren't the problem. You know? We constantly will find, even in this Me Too movement, even more recent successes that we've had, it's men pushing back. You know, they push back around, don't believe them anymore. Don't believe them. They're all lying. They're all lying. You've heard it. You know, remember what happened to Harvey Weinstein? And contrast that with Kevin Spacey. Now, I know you've heard from somebody from the LGBT background, spokesman this morning. Kevin Spacey, allegations were made against him by young men. And what we did to Kevin Spacey was we wrote him out. Wrote him out of a movie altogether. They reshot the film. He doesn't exist anymore. Harvey Weinstein, allegations against him were made by young women. We asked the women, what were they wearing? Why were they in his room? How much did they drink? Victim blaming, victim blaming, victim blaming, because that's what men do. And unless you tackle this issue of misogyny, and the reason why I say, you know, there's a reason why it's called his story, history. Yeah? We rewrite history, we rewrite nursery rhymes. Do you know what happened in Sleeping Beauty? Tell me, what happened in Sleeping Beauty? Sleeping Beauty, she's walking through a forest, she's given a curse by a wicked witch, she ends up sleeping in a coma, she's woken up by her handsome prince. Isn't that the story? Nope, that's not the first story. The first story was, she's walking through a forest, she's raped, she goes into catatonic shock, she only awakes 9 months later when she gives birth to the child born of that rape. But what does Disney didn't like that version. What man has done is rewritten it. so that the woman, the wicked witch, the man, the handsome prince. See what we do? This is what we do. This is what we do all the time. And so this is why you have to fight this issue of misogyny in the schools, in education. This is why gender equality, all of those subjects have to be discussed in school. And school, I say, because education is the answer to this. And there's evidence out there, research out there that says you can identify the propensity to violence of a child from the age of 4 or 5. So why do we wait till they're 14 and 15 before we start talking about these subjects? The earlier we do it in the most age-appropriate way, the more likely it is that we will have an impact. I remember talking to a young man who was 21, born and brought up in this country, Sikh heritage. He came to me and he said, Nazir, you don't get it, he said, man is a piece of gold, he said, woman is a piece of silk. And I said, that sounds really good. And he goes, but if you drop a piece of gold in mud, you can wipe it clean. If you drop a piece of silk in mud, it's stained forever. That is his attitude to women and girls. You know, men, we can wipe clean everything that we do wrong. Women, stained forever. He was born, educated in this country. So how do we change that? How do we get them to understand that we believe in gender equality, that we will not allow misogyny and patriarchy to persist and maintain? Well, we have to educate, and we have to start as early as possible. When I gave evidence to Parliament back 10 years ago now, I was talking about this production of Oliver that was going around schools in the south of England. You know what happens to Nancy in Oliver? She's murdered by Bill Sykes in a controlling situation, but not in that production that was going around schools in the south of England, because the teachers and the governors and the head teachers did not want children exposed to this issue. 1 in 4 are exposed to it at home, in the real world, but we want to wrap them up in cotton wool rather than have a proper discussion with them about what it is that they're experiencing. 2 women every week murdered by partners or ex-partners. 10 women every week killing themselves because of domestic abuse. 1 in 4 domestic abuse victims. 1 in 4 women domestic abuse victims. 1 in 5 women sexually assaulted. 1 in 5 women stalked. We have a serious problem in our communities, in our society, and we can only tackle it through education. But when we talk about education, what are we going to do differently? It's to recognize that young people receive their information differently now. When my son was given a leaflet recently, he goes, Dad, what's this? We still operate in paper. They don't. They get all their information from Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter. We should be engaging with them on a level that they engage with. And the best education, ladies and gentlemen, is peer-to-peer. No child listens to an older person. My child don't listen to me. But children do listen to other young people. We need an army. Scotland needs an army of young people who are engaging and talking about all of these issues that we're touching on today, going into schools, primary, kindergarten, you name it, talking about these issues in order to get people engaged. But more importantly, as importantly, those young people who are doing it should be paid for it. Time and time again, I say to a 17 or 18-year-old, do it because it's good for your CV. I say that when I want something for free. Yeah, recognize it? If we value it as a society, we should be paying young people to do this. It is shocking that NGOs like Shakti and others have to rely so much on volunteers. You know, it's brilliant the volunteers are prepared to give up their time and energy to do that, but we should be paying for this because we're valuing it rather than expecting it to happen. But those young people going and talking to other young people is the key. But we've got a problem, loads of problems, but 2 in particular I can think of, that we now have Generation Spotify. Generation Spotify is the one where they create their own playlist. We used to listen to the radio, we would listen to messages wherever we got them on TV. Young people don't get it that way. They get their own, they make up their own playlist. So how do we get our messages, across to young people, given that they have their own playlists? And then we have Generation SatNav. You know, the one that says, Edinburgh this way, Cliff that way. SatNav says, Cliff, I must go that way. You know, that we have to be guided everywhere we go. So when you've got those 2 types of generations, how are you going to get your messages across? I go back to what I said, peer-to-peer. Young people know what young people think. Young people are really strong. And the other thing that needs to be said is about victims and survivors. That they need to be not only in the room. You know, time and time again, people say, oh, we have a system now where victims are at the center of it. There's a legal phrase for that. It's bullshit. Yeah, we may say it, yet we still don't do it. Yeah? We need victim survivors to be at our table telling us what we should be doing differently, and then us responding accordingly. I go back and I finish with why I started 25 plus years ago, when I was talking at a conference not unlike this, and I noticed a woman in the room, and I went up to her afterwards, and I noticed that she had her wedding ring not on her wedding finger, but on the opposite finger of her hand. And I said to her, why are you wearing your wedding ring on the wrong finger? And she said, it's because my family forced me to marry the wrong man. And I looked at her, and I saw a woman that suffers daily rape. I saw a woman that lives in hopelessness and in despair, whose life is completely destroyed. But that was it. That was her protest, because nobody anywhere was listening. And I made it my responsibility to be her voice. Thank you so much.